Hello and welcome to your Daily Detroit, sharing what to know and where to go in Southeast Michigan. I am Jer Stays, and it's Wednesday, January 10th, 2024. Today, a feature conversation. From the Daily Detroit studio at Techtown, joining me is the director of Henry Ford Museum of Innovation, Cynthia Jones. Welcome to Daily Detroit. I got to tell you, I am such a history nerd. So when I realized who you are and that you're coming here, I was a little nervous. So welcome.
Thank you so much. If it makes you less nervous, I don't actually have a history degree.
Oh, okay.
So I actually come from a background in American culture and technology and not technically history. So sometimes that makes people a little bit less nervous.
But I wonder if that gives you a different lens on things.
It absolutely does. So I think about big patterns. I think about change over time, also things that historians think about. I get a little less absorbed by the minute details and a whole lot more about big change and the big bits of culture.
I also imagine, though, that you have quite the staff to handle all the little details.
I sure do. So, and I also have just amazing colleagues, from our curatorial folks to our folks who keep the entire place clean and running, to the folks who sell tickets. And it takes a huge amount of people to do what we do at the Henry Ford.
There are a number of topics we want to hit and, of course, talk about the Mandela official exhibition that is going on right now. This is like kind of the little parlor stat that I share with people. I was talking with the Visit Detroit folks, and the Henry Ford is the biggest tourist draw in this region. And I think that we should share a little bit more about like what it is and what you all do before we get started for the uninitiated, in case it's like, oh, well, it's this thing in Dearborn that I've heard about, but maybe I haven't been, or maybe I went 10 years ago or something. It is, and you are kind of a big deal.
We are pretty much a big deal. We often undersell that in this region. Detroiters, we tend to be somewhat humble. And I think that's a wonderful thing about this region. But I also think we should take pride in what we have. And the Henry Ford is one of those things to really take pride in. We are approaching our 100th anniversary. We're looking towards that in 2029. So we've been around a while. We do all sorts of things. We have a television show on CBS, The Innovation Nation.
Mo Rocca, right?
Mo Rocca.
I keep wondering if one day I'm just going to randomly run into him at the museum.
You just might. He loves us. We have our own on-site high school. So we have a public charter high school in the museum in Greenfield Village.
Funny fact, my Friday co-host, Devin, went there.
Oh, fantastic.
And here's an even funnier fact. My dad, I don't know what the iteration was, but my dad's high school graduation photo is in front of the church. So what would that be in the 50s?
So
40s?
In the 50s. So he probably, was he part of the Henry Ford trade school that was happening on the grounds? Yes, absolutely. So 1950s trade school. We actually have a statue for that in front of one of our venues, the Ford Rouge Factory Tour, which is on site at Ford's Rouge Complex. So we run the Ford Rouge Factory Tour. We have Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. We have Greenfield Village, our outdoor living history experience. We have the Benson Ford Research Center, where we keep our archives. We have a giant screen experience theater. It just goes on and on and on. Across an average year, we'll see about 1.6 million people on our campuses, and we serve millions of people with all of our digital content, because we also have something called InHub, which is for teachers and educators across the country. And we're also part of something called Invention Convention, which is in multiple states across the country, encourages kids to do invention competitions.
That's very cool. I imagine, too, it kind of helps. You've got the dual big engines of Greenfield Village, which I learned before we got on the air has its own mayor. And the Henry Ford, you've got kind of indoor attractions and outdoor attractions in the same, well, frankly, gigantic campus.
We're pretty huge, so you can find us just off the Southfield Freeway there. We have our own road, Village Drive, that takes you right on in past Greenfield Village. Greenfield Village is about 88 acres outdoors. Henry Ford Museum, 9 acres under a single roof. It is a massive complex.
There are a number of things always going on at the Henry Ford, and one specifically I want to talk about because time is short on this one. The official exhibition for Mandela, which look, we're coming up on Martin Luther King Day. We're coming up on all these things of, Black History Month. And part of it is, for me, is not just like the day off or whatever, but I think it's incumbent on everyone, especially, and this is just my personal opinion, folks that look like me, to do work and do education through that, to always work to be better and use that time, whether, when you're not working or something like that, to do better and try to be better with everything. And so I took the opportunity to go to the Mandela exhibit, and wow, the 7 galleries. What a fascinating character. I knew about him, and I know he's had some ties to the United States and visiting and trips like that. But it's one thing when you realize and see all the stuff in person, it's like a century of impact.
It really is close to a century of impact, actually, yes. And when I really started digging into Nelson Mandela, I had heard that this exhibition was touring out of South Africa. I was very curious if we could bring it here. I was very curious if it had visited a city that Nelson Mandela had visited, because I knew that Nelson Mandela had come to Detroit in 1990. It had not. So we're the first place that this exhibition has been that Nelson Mandela had toured on that Freedom Tour in 1990, and I thought that was really important. I knew about Mandela. I'll give away my age here. So in the 80s, when I was in high school and early college, apartheid and the anti-apartheid movement was one of the first civil rights movements that I really engaged in, and it was something that I knew about. I started asking my younger staff, what do you know about apartheid? They didn't necessarily know a lot about apartheid. They didn't necessarily know a lot about Nelson Mandela. They didn't necessarily make a connection between Nelson Mandela and American civil rights figures like Martin Luther King. And I said, okay, this is very important for us to bring. It is incredibly important that we understand that civil rights is not just a U.S. thing. It's not just something in the past, that it is ongoing, it is today, and it was global, and it was globally connected. And so for us as an institution that really thinks about American innovation, I needed to thread the needle on how a global figure, Nelson Mandela, connected to our collections, connected to our city. That was very easy to do. And I think it is important to always be thinking beyond our local and getting really global, because you can't think about civil rights and think about it as just my community. It is a global.
This struggle has been going on for so long, and there's so many permutations of it, and you can see echoes of the struggles here or there. I mean, history can teach us lessons. I mean, it doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, and those lessons we can carry forward.
Absolutely, and I think we can also ask, what did they get right that maybe we haven't yet? So one of the big conversations that we have had over the last year in the museum, MLK Day 2023, we had the interfaith group with us in the museum, and they were doing some things about bridging to belonging and thinking about racial reconciliation. We haven't really done a whole lot of that as a country. South Africa did. And I really think about Nelson Mandela's leadership after he made it through imprisonment, was elected. South Africa is coming out of a near civil war. How was he going to repair? What was his vision? And his vision was so big. It was not simply freedom for one group. It was freedom for everyone. And truth and reconciliation was so important in that process. And I think it's one of those things, it's in the final gallery. I think it's incredibly important that we at least think about that. Have we done that personally? Have we done that in our community? Have we done that in our country? What can we learn from a country that did? How might we apply that?
One of the quotes that stuck with me is, free yourself, free others, and serve every day. And I think that can be carried through. And I think that energy, another thing he said, to lament over it does not eradicate it. And I think about the time and the amount of time. Obviously, there's always still issues and things like that, but the amount of work that was done in Mandela's life till now and how much progress was able to be made in human history in a very short time. And are there things we can take from that for our own experience here in the United States?
Absolutely. And I think if you think about it, Mandela was freed in 1990, and 4 years later, he becomes the first democratically elected president of South Africa. He has won a Nobel Peace Prize with de Klerk by his side, the last white president of apartheid era, 4 years of transformation. What can we do in 4 years? I mean, there's just a tremendous amount we can do in 4 years. I look around and think about that every day, and I think about getting it down to even smaller bites. One of the things that is promoted globally for Nelson Mandela is that he served basically for 67 years. And so there's this piece about committing 67 minutes of service in his honor on his birthday every year in July. We thought about that for Detroit, but 67 has a different connotation here in Detroit.
Very much so. I was friends with Marlo Stoudemeyer, who put together the 67 exhibit at the Historical Museum, which I think it's okay to cross-promote a little bit. Go check out that one, too.
Absolutely.
That's a great work over there. But that act of service and doing it, because I think, people look at social media, whatever, and I know from talking to listeners, people get frustrated. It feels like you can't do anything. But if you focus on things you can control or taking steps every day, all of a sudden those little bits end up making a lot of progress.
They do. And I really think about that. We're in January. This is the time where we set our great resolutions for the year. What if you just did one thing every day? And what if that thing was small? What if it was you learned someone's name that you didn't know before? What if you reached towards someone? I think that's one of the lessons I've really taken out of Mandela, are some of the very small lessons. He very purposefully learned how to speak Afrikaans. So he chose to speak the language that had been weaponized against him. That's a huge step. What if I learned a few words in someone else's language? What would that do to create connection? There are so many things we can choose to do, and they don't have to be huge. They can be small steps that start to add up.
What is a highlight or two among the 7 galleries that called to you? There's a few for me, but what called to you and you're like, I'm really glad that this is here at the museum?
There's about 150 actual artifacts that are touring out of South Africa that are in this exhibition. One of those are letters, handwritten letters, seeing his penmanship, thinking about the fact that, while computers were certainly around in his later years, he never really typed. He hand wrote. And I really started to think about that, and I started to read those letters and think about that even more. And then I was told this absolutely stunning story about how we have those letters. We have those letters in part because he kept a copy of everything he wrote while he was imprisoned so that he would know what he'd written to you, because he could only write his wife about 2 times a year. He needed to keep up. And what had I told you? I don't want to waste time telling you other things. But then the jailers started to steal his letters and destroy them. It was a way to break him down. He encouraged them and found a way to have a garden in the prison. And then he buried his letters underneath the trees in the garden. And so the reason we have those letters is because he created this beautiful space. He convinced his jailers to have a garden, and then he buried the letters. And what a thoughtful act to ensure that your legacy, the things that mattered to you, were not getting destroyed and lost.
I also think about the parallels to, say, Eastern philosophy, with the idea that we should plant trees of which the shade we will never see. And I see echoes of that in that. I mean, obviously the letters didn't sprout, but it's that idea of, using the tree ends up being metaphorical in some ways as well.
It does. And I think, okay, those letters that were buried under the tree didn't sprout, but the content of the letters that he was distributing out of imprisonment, that certainly sprouted. So I think about his wife at the time, Winnie Mandela, and how Winnie would take those letters, and she carried his legacy for decades while he was imprisoned. And so you think about those words and how those words sprouted beyond even when he was jailed. As I think about MLK Day coming up, as I think about Black History Month, I think about the importance of words, the importance of Letter from a Birmingham Jail from Martin Luther King, and thinking about how your words are not trapped by your situation. Your words can echo and resonate both across time as a history organization, but across so much.
One artifact that affected me more than I thought it would when I first saw it was the suit that he wore to Parliament. And it affected me because you realize this is a tall man. This is like the presence is there with the mannequin and everything else. Obviously, it's of his frame, but it's not him, right? But it's his frame. You can see, and since it's his clothes and his stuff, there is something about that actual artifactness that emotionally impacts you. And I did not expect it because I'm like, wait a second, it feels like I'm standing next to this man.
I had a very similar. It was standing in front of that suit and thinking about, oh my God, how would I feel if I actually met Nelson Mandela? I mean, it was that moment of just, and I got a little bit of chills. And the other thing I thought about looking at that suit, there's also a trench coat that he wore. There's a number of other things in there that really get to his clothing, his personality. I also thought about how much he understood how he carried himself, how he presented himself would be how the world treats him. Mm. And if you look at that suit, it's not particularly luxurious. It's a gray suit. It's quite simple. It's quite democratic in many ways. You think about it and you think it looks relatively affordable.
It's nice, but it's not flashy.
It's nice, but it's not flashy. And you think about that and you think, what does that mean? And I think it causes you to think about that a bit more than if it wasn't there.
Yeah, yeah. This exhibit is running until January 15th. So if you're going to go, the time is now. Like if you're hearing this and saying, hey, I'm thinking about it, like if you've got some time this week or this weekend, get in there because time's a ticking on this one. But I did want to highlight it because I think it's so relevant to everything that's coming up with a larger vision of MLK Day and all of that stuff. This isn't the only thing. It's really easy to say, well, this is an exhibit that's great, whatever. But this does not stand alone in what the museum is doing to tell a better, fuller story around all of this, right? There's more to this.
Absolutely. I think of the Mandela exhibition, things that we do like this are invitations to the community to think about us perhaps a little differently. If you haven't been there since 4th or 5th grade, please come back. Please take a look at us because we are a different organization. We care deeply about telling just a much broader range of stories, and I can point to that across all of our venues, across the Greenfield Village, across even the factory tour, telling a lot more labor stories, across the museum, and it is a commitment for us. So we're committed to shows like this. We're also committed to our MLK Day programming. We're growing to 3 days this year, so Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. We're committed throughout Black History Month, and we're committed across the year. We need to tell important, inclusive stories of people that matter to our region, but also people you may have never heard of that we can introduce you to that open your eyes and help you think about things. So one of those that we do out in Greenfield Village is we recently acquired and opened up the Detroit Central Market. It was the vegetable building market. And we were researching people that sold vegetables or sold things in the market. And we found this woman named Mary Judge. And Mary Judge became quite infamous in the time of the market in the 1860s, 1870s. She was written up in a lot of notes in the Detroit City Council. She was a colorful character. We thought it's important to talk about people like that, because those are everyday people and their stories tell us so much. So we are going to tell you stories about Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks. We're also going to tell you stories about everyday people, and because most of us are everyday people. So let's think about what each of us can do.
I cannot wait to check that out at the Village because I'm a huge Eastern Market fan. I go often, and just to see those kind of things and see it, restored. I've seen pictures and videos, but it's a whole different story. You're also opening up some new things too, right?
We absolutely are. One of the things that we announced in 2023 and actually just got moved here in December of 2023 and that we're moving towards opening, it'll take us a couple of years. We were offered and have acquired a house out of Selma, Alabama. And it's the Jackson family home out of Selma, Alabama. We moved it from Alabama to this region, Detroit area, in December. It's quite a process to move a house, let me tell you. But what is so important about that is that it both is the story of the Jackson family, Joanna Jackson and all of her relatives. They were professional African Americans in Alabama. They have their own rich history. Part of their rich history is their open hospitality to a huge number of people, including Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King planned the Selma to Montgomery March in that home. And so bringing that history to this region, I think, is incredibly important. We're getting ready to rebuild that home, to open it. It's going to take us a few years. But it is a process that I think is incredibly important for this region, incredibly important for collaboration. It puts us on the civil rights trail, if you think about it. The Rosa Parks bust certainly does as well in our collection.
I was going to mention that one because it's one of the pieces that I feel like I always have to, and that exhibit in general, I feel like I always have to circle back through it and almost pay it respects, in many ways, because Rosa was such a big deal in our area and a big deal for the country. But her connection to Metro Detroit, I mean, it was long standing, not just the bus, which was down south, but her work with civil rights up here afterward was large. And so it's an emotional experience to go on that bus and sit on it.
It absolutely is. And one of the things that we're working on right now is we've been really telling the story of people beyond Rosa that did this work as well. Rosa, obviously, trailblazer, amazing on her own rights, and the work that she did after Montgomery is so important. When we talk about that bus now, I often say, I'm going to talk to you about the Montgomery bus boycott. 385 days of communal action towards change. I'm not just going to talk to you about Rosa Parks and how she planned for that and trained for that. And she was not just the quiet, tired lady that we sometimes get told about. No, she was an activist and she was trained and she was collaborating. We are actually bringing forward on MLK weekend a brand new piece that we've been workshopping, a new theatrical piece that talks about the day after. So she takes her action. We're starting a boycott. The boycott goes well on that first day. Now what? And there's a historic meeting in a church, and we're pulling out 4 of those figures that includes Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and a couple of others. And we're talking about how do you decide as a community to invest in more than one day of boycott? How do you decide to stick it out? How do you constantly innovate new solutions when every roadblock that can be conceived of is thrown in your way? How do you persevere for the entire length that it took to really make change? And I think that's such an important story today because it's so easy now on social media to go, oh, this is the burning thing. I'm passionate about this today. I'm going to hashtag this and I'm going to talk about it. Well, what about tomorrow? What about 10 days from then? What about 2 years from then? Are you still committed?
A family member who was an activist, and a key part of it was, are people willing to make real sacrifices for the cause? Are they willing to skip hours of work? Are they willing to give their time and treasure? Are they willing to have a hard conversation with their family for the thing they believe in? And that in many ways is the litmus test of like, what can you do action on and what is something that you need to lobby on and work on, and it'll take time. But that is kind of your split right there. And I think in some ways we've kind of lost that muscle a little bit. And it would be interesting to see some of those skills kind of come back.
I agree we've lost that muscle. That's part of why when we brought Nelson Mandela and the exhibition forward, we thought it was so important because this is someone who spent a lifetime on a cause.
Well, Cynthia Jones, Henry Ford, Director of Museum Experiences, and a very long title, but I'm really appreciative of your time here on Daily Detroit, and please come back soon.
I will, absolutely. Thank you so much for having us, and please, if you're listening, please make time. Get out here for Nelson Mandela before or on MLK Day, and if you can't, come out and visit us. We are doing a lot of good stuff.
If you get a membership, you can just come on by.
That is absolutely true.
And that's it for the show. Thank you so much for listening. Remember, 5 stars on your favorite podcast app for Daily Detroit. With that, I am Jer Stays. Remember that you are somebody, and we'll see you around town.